Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Seeing the Gaps, Journey Mapping for Better Health Outcomes. Before we get started, I'm just going to give you a little background on who we are at Medulin. For those of you who haven't worked with us before, Medulin is a digital health firm headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We design and build high-impact health solutions that deliver direct and measurable outcomes for healthcare businesses, providers, innovators, and patients. Your guide for our webinar today is Jim Williams. He is the Senior Manager of User Experience here at Medulin, and I'm going to pass it over to him to take you through today's content.
Okay, welcome everybody. I've been at Medulin working in UX for the last 3 years. Before that, I've worked at a variety of product and agency companies working on developing better UX for everybody. I'm afraid I've got a little bit of a cold, so you'll have to put up with my sexy voice today, but we'll manage to get through it. We're going to be talking about experience mapping or journey mapping, talk a little bit about the different kinds of approaches, some of the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches, when to best use them and use them to advantage. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to set up and run your own workshop, and a little bit of time at the end for questions. So I hope this will be very, very helpful for everyone. Instead of journey mapping, I tend to call it experience mapping. I like a slightly broader definition of the term. We're trying to come up with innovation and new ways of thinking about things, so I like to have a little bit of a broader approach. A lot of times experience mapping goes beyond just space and time and looks at ideas and attitudes as well. So I tend to think of it as mapping an experience rather than merely a journey. And while it's a trending topic and you hear about it in all the trade journals and people talk about it in service design, and it seems like the new latest thing that everybody wants some of. It's not a new technique. It's been around for a really long time. Product design companies were using it long before the internet was invented, and actually the classic example of experience mapping comes from the 19th century. Charles Monod's chart that traces the Napoleonic Grande Armée from Paris on the winter campaign against Moscow. And you see how the army gradually shrinks in beige as it moves its way toward Moscow. And then on the retreat back in black, it continues to shrink. The bottom shows the temperatures that they're encountering along the way. And it provides really a sort of visceral and painful graphic representation of how that army just was completely destroyed by this campaign. So this gives us a great something to work from. Is what you really want to do is find a way of communicating a really important part of experience in a way that becomes really visible and visceral, and you can sort of look at it in a glance and go, oh my God, I've learned something from this, and I kind of feel the user or the customer's pain or experience in some way. And again, I talk about experience mapping rather than just journey mapping. Menard's map showed a journey, but a lot of times we're not moving through space and time. We're looking at mindsets or attitudes or approaches. So this particular map from Carol Dweck is really just about mindsets and how those things, when they encounter different kinds of activities or obstacles, respond and do things differently. And it's a good way of putting those things into context and comparing them, and helps you to think about them in a way that you can apply them to projects or whatever it is that you're working on. Also, they don't always have to include people. Most of the ones that we'll be talking about will be focused on customers or prospects or users for particular software. They don't always need to include people. This particular one about coffee traces the different kinds of grinds and processes, serving techniques, adjuncts that can be folded into coffee, gives a really good overview of all the different ways to experience and enjoy and create coffee. And you can sort of sit back and absorb and look at the thing and learn a great deal and have a great sense of what this process is about. It leads you to ask questions. It's whimsical. It's inviting. It's really an excellent example of what a map could be, even though it includes no people or customers whatsoever. So trying to stick with that broader sense of what this sort of mapping can be and what it can accomplish. Also, you see a lot of really beautifully done ones, but they don't have to always be complex. Sometimes the ones that are simple actually solve more problems and get greater use. This particular very simple one was done to solve a rather complex problem. It was looking at the distribution of benefits for a large health benefits organization that included not just health benefits, insurance, financial, 401k, all of this sort of stuff. And for a wide kind of population, broke it down into 5 very simple things based on a sort of time versus income graph, and showing the different kinds of vehicles that should be served up to these different segments and different people, and how those people gradually transform over time from people just starting their working life to people who are retired and in their sunset years. So a very simple chart that conveys a lot of information and simplifies a very complex process. So the maps themselves don't have to be exorbitant and complex to be extremely helpful, and sometimes they can take things that are very complex and render them much easier to understand and easier to follow. There are a number of different approaches. When I was talking with some of my colleagues in preparing for the webinar today, we looked at a number of different ways we go about doing these things. And there seem to be 2 general basic approaches to the way we do these things. One was the workshop-based approach, which you get a bunch of people together in a room. They could be the design team. More often than not, it includes a significant number of stakeholders or clients. Most important of all is you want people who are in contact with the customers, because you're trying to sort of map out what the customers are doing. And you get everybody together in a room. You start talking about what are the steps, what are the interactions with the customer, how does this work, what are their attitudes at the different step. And together, by the end of a day or 2, you've put together kind of a draft of a map. The maps tend to be a little bit linear. They move from beginning to end. They usually are focused on a single customer or a set of segments. They tend to follow a fairly similar pattern, but they're very quick to make. And if you've got the right people in the room, can be incredibly useful and provide a lot of learning for a group. The other kind of approach is a little bit harder and a little bit more time-consuming. It's the research-based approach. Instead of starting off with stakeholders and getting everybody together in a room, it starts a little bit more expansively. You find a bunch of users or customers, you go out and interview them. Ideally, you interview them in the actual setting in which they're in, so you can observe their surroundings, things that may be distracting for them, other things they have to pay attention to in addition to what you're working on. You get a lot more context. You learn a lot more about what people are actually going through as they're using your product or making decisions or engaging with your service. These take a lot more time. They require people who are experienced in doing this kind of interviewing. I've seen you could probably get away with doing as few as 3 interviews. I think the largest project I've worked on, which was a large product development exercise, which was several years in the making, we interviewed 60 different people all over the country. So these things vary from you could probably pull it off in a week to it could take months and have a rather large budget. A lot of it depends upon what you're trying to solve and what you're trying to accomplish. These tend to be a little bit more open-ended. The workshop-based ones tend to, you tend to follow that. You begin here are the steps you go. Research-based ones can end up looking like that also, but a lot of times, because they're taking into consideration a number of extra factors, they end up being a little bit different. They follow a slightly different pattern. They tend to be a little bit more unique. Strengths and weaknesses of the 2 different. First of all, I want to talk about the strengths of doing a journey map or an experience map in the first place. Um, One of the most important things of this is it brings the customer into your design process. A lot of times you can get wrapped up in thinking, well, when I'm designing this, you tend to think of what would I do in this situation. You try to put yourself in the position of the user. You're bringing a lot of your own preconceptions and ideas to it. You may not always share those with the customer. So putting together a map like this brings the actual customer to bear on the project. If the map is put together in an easy to follow way, it may create a very powerful impression. It brings this understanding to a wider audience. So while your sales reps and your customer service reps may be in contact with customers all day long, not always does that understanding follow through into the rest of the design group. So it brings this understanding to a wider audience. It oftentimes provides a deeper and fuller picture of who that customer is, because you're tracing them through every step, not just perhaps the touch points that are most salient, the conversion, the adding things to the cart, the making the sale. You tend to think about the whole journey, and in putting together the map, you find things that you may not have been thinking about before. So there are a lot of elements of that customer experience that often have been underserved or underrepresented or people hadn't thought about. It brings those things to the fore. The whole design team, stakeholders become aware of them. It's more likely to work with them. So that's really kind of one of the strengths of putting together an experience map in the first place. There's not really a lot of weaknesses. It's a very worthwhile exercise to do in whatever form you can find time and money to do. The workshop format, like I said before, because you're dealing with a coordinated activity, a lot of times the map tends to look a little bit similar. They sort of start on the left, they end at the right, they follow a sort of temporal sequence across. Sometimes the maps trace out through a trip through space, or so not outer space, but the space of a retail store or a space of a trip to a doctor or something like that. So you're moving through offices or rooms or parking spots, or dealing with a variety of the receptionist, dealing with the nurse practitioner, dealing with the doctor. But they all tend to sort of follow a chronological pathway. I don't think of this as really a disadvantage because they do look sort of similar. But part of that is an advantage because they're really easy to understand. You can look at all three of these and say, I have a sense of what's going on here. It's a common pattern. It's really easy to go, I'm starting from the left, I'm moving to the right. Here are the things that are happening to my customer. Here are particular points that are of interest. So they're pretty easy to understand. The workshop-based approach is fairly easy to get started. It doesn't require a lot of experience. It doesn't require a lot of equipment. Another huge benefit from the workshop-based approach is it helps to get buy-in from everyone involved. You've got the stakeholders who are contributing. You've got the design team who's there in the room working with the stakeholders. You've got people who are in contact with the customers. Everybody's in the room working on this stuff. So you end up leaving the workshop with a shared understanding. Everybody's kind of on the same page. They're focused on the same things. You leave the room with a shared understanding of who the customer is, what their pain points are, what kinds of things you need to focus on in your project. One of the disadvantages from these come if you invite the wrong people, not the wrong people, but you don't invite enough people who are in contact with the customers enough. You may not be getting enough real customer input into the workshop. Another thing too is if there are some misconceptions about the customer, you're adding those to your experience map, which could be a disadvantage. You're sort of codifying wrong information. Also, because it's a little bit formulaic, you don't often end up with the brilliant new insight of, oh my God, I had no idea my customers thought this way, because you're dealing with people sharing information that you know about the customer. So there's really not going to be often a lot of surprises. It's really kind of sharing of information, making sure everybody in the group has the information, finding a way to visually represent that information. So it's only really as good as the quality of the information that the participants bring to the workshop. But they are easy to put together. They don't take a great deal of time. You get a lot of buy-in from everybody that's participating in the workshop, and it's easy to disseminate that information. Research base, a little bit different. Because you're dealing with a specialized kind of research, it requires a little bit of experience and expertise. You need to have researchers who are experienced with doing that kind of open-ended research, people who know how to sort of follow a customer in their own sort of understanding, not ask them leading questions, but really sort of sit back and pretend they're from Mars. I'm from Mars. I have never seen anything like this before. What is it that you're doing? How are you thinking about this process? What are the things that are going on? And one of the big advantages of this is that you end up with these big insights. These are the kinds of situations where you find out, oh my God, I had no idea our customers did this, or I had no idea our customers thought this way. Or we spend all our time presenting our beautiful software in the boardroom on the flat screen TV in the darkened room, and everybody thought it was awesome, and it never occurred to us that the actual user has it in their left hand trying to manipulate it with their thumb while they hold their baby in the right hand, and the train is going by. So by actually sitting in context with these people, you end up with sometimes some really big revelations that you never thought about sitting in the workshop. On the other hand, doing this research can be time-consuming and expensive. It takes a good bit of time, especially depending upon the number of interviews you're doing. If you've got a number of different customer segments, you need to be able to talk to at least a couple of people out of each of the segments. Sometimes you may need to explore different geographic regions to make sure you're not dealing just with some local regional issues. So this kind of research can get fairly expensive. And take a considerable amount of time, and does require a little bit of practice and expertise. You need a fairly good team of people who have been working in this and have some experience with it. So this is the sort of approach that yields big insight, but it also requires some commitment. Also, there's the chance that you won't come up with that big insight. Maybe you already understand your customers fairly well. You'll get confirmation of that understanding, but you may not get that big insight that you were hoping for. So those are some of the strengths and weaknesses of those two different approaches. When to use them? The strengths and weaknesses probably gave you a little bit of an idea as to which approach may be best for you. But the workshop-based approach is really good if you're new to experience mapping. If you've not done this before, if this is a new kind of activity for you, start off simple with the workshop. The workshop doesn't require as large an investment in time or money. It can be done in a day or so, or if it's a small project, you might even be able to put together an hour or two workshop to work through this sort of thing. The output is more predictable and consistent. You're pretty much guaranteed to leave the room with something that will be useful. And if you really want the whole team engaged and getting on board and having a common understanding, this is a good exercise to bring people together and make them feel like they're involved in participating, and to bring agreement about what you're aiming for on a project. The research-based approach, you need to be a little bit more uncomfortable with risk. You don't always know exactly where you're going to end up at the end. You may end up with great insight. You may end up with confirmation of what you already knew. It does require a little bit more investment in time and money. It takes a little bit more effort to come up with this stuff. You need to have experienced researchers. This is usually probably not the first thing to if you've never done it before, this is probably not the way to start. But if you are looking for a big breakthrough innovation, this is usually the approach that yields that. You're likely to find it using this way. Now that we've talked about it a little bit, if you want to get started doing a experience mapping workshop, if you're new to this, can kind of bring you through some of the basics and show you how this is done, give you a sense of how you can set this up yourself. First of all, some supplies. These are the things that we typically use. You don't have to have all of these things. You could do it as simple as a piece of paper, but to really get everybody involved, you want to have a good-sized room, whiteboards if possible. Easels with flip charts are also useful. Love the whiteboard or blackboard idea, though. Of course, you'll need whiteboard markers, Sharpies, and other kinds of markers that are helpful. Usually we go to these kinds of workshops with multiple Post-it notes. They can represent different kinds of user segments. They can represent different kinds of activities. They can represent different stakeholders and participants or interests. The colors are really very useful for sorting a lot of different things. Sticker dots are helpful for sort of voting on prioritization or modifying your Post-its or things on the whiteboard. Flip chart size Post-it notes are also really useful. And name tags for the participants so that everybody knows who's involved and what's going on. So you don't need all of these things. All of these things are really helpful and useful. Really, you could get by with a whiteboard and set of markers. The important thing is to get people together and get them participating. The most important thing, though, is the participants. The quality, the outcome of your workshop is in some ways based upon the kind of people who are there. Having the right kind of people with the right kind of understanding, especially people who know the customer, will make your final map much more useful. Having people there who have bought in and are really interested and excited about the project also helps the map to reach a wider audience. More people will be using it throughout the project. So most important thing, get people there who have spent time with the user or the customer or whatever segments you're working with. We tend to look for people who have backgrounds in sales or customer service, people who have experience working on call centers, anyone who spends a lot of time dealing with the customers, knows what kinds of things they're experiencing pain with, knows what things make them really excited, knows the difference between a good day for a customer and a bad day for a customer, and can really do a good job of talking about that experience, because that's the thing you're really trying to learn here. So the more people that you can bring to the workshop that know about the customer and have a different sort of impression or view of the customer, the better. While on that, diversity is good. If you've got people with different interests and concerns, the more complete and informative the map may be. So people from different parts of the company, people who are trying to do or accomplish different kinds of things, the more viewpoints you get incorporated in the map, the more useful it will be for different people, and the fewer gaps you are to have as you sort of fill the thing in. People who have different kinds of experience, some people will know more about some part of the journey or experience than others, so the more diversity you've got, the better. Also, you want to make sure you've got people who are invested, people who care about the project, people who want this thing to work. It's good to get everybody together. You're working toward the same vision. You get a sort of alignment about what you're looking at, what problems you're trying to solve, how the customer feels, and how you're trying to address that. So I think really for a great workshop, the most important piece you need to have is finding and getting the right kinds of participants with the right kind of background information. The workshop itself, it doesn't have to be anything tremendously complicated. Often we will usually start off by making a horizontal grid and saying, okay, what are the kind of basic steps the customer, the segment goes through. A lot of times those will be in sort of larger groups. As we continue, we'll fill in the details. We'll make that sort of horizontal grid a little bit more detail and show those sort of steps in greater detail. They go from their mobile device to a digital media to a face-to-face engagement. So a lot of times we'll add those in either through markers or Post-its. You'll get kind of a horizontal view of here are the steps in the path. On the vertical grid, you want to get a sense of who your user segments are. They could be different kinds of customers. They could be customers, sales reps, interaction points, things like that. And this in itself could be a huge exercise, and it might be one that you do before your experience mapping workshop. A lot of times when we're running workshops, we'll spend an entire workshop to talk about segments and personas to get these segments well defined, make sure we've got the right ones, the most significant ones, make sure we've got a little bit of a deep understanding of who they are. A lot of times your marketing department will have this information already, and you may be able to just pull up some existing reports and use those as the basis of your building your experience map. Other times you may want to spend some time and construct these things. So you've got your sort of steps of the journey, you've got your different kind of users who are going through that journey. Now you want to start filling in the details. What happens to each of these different user segments or users as they move through that journey? Things to think about are what are the tasks that they're performing? What are the other kinds of things that may be vying for their attention? What are the things they're thinking about? What are their feelings? What's the level of engagement they've got? What's their commitment to this process or the thing that you're working on? Try to fill these in as full as you can get them. And often by the end of the day, you'll have this gigantic grid of all sorts of steps, all sorts of segments, lots of tasks and feelings and engagement, and you'll see spots that are missing, and this will help to sort of give you a sense of the gaps. And the gaps will be, have we underserved this? Do we not understand what happens to people at this point? You can kind of look at the map and say, we didn't fill anything in here. Does anybody in the room know about what happens when family member B gets to inside the museum C? What are the things that are happening there? And you may or may not have answers to these questions, and that can be a good thing because it shows where you need to follow up, where you need to do a little bit more research, perhaps actually contact some customers and ask them a little bit about what's happening with them when they go through that sort of thing. You may find that, when we built our software before, we totally left this out of consideration. It hadn't occurred to us that this is happening before. So it's a good way of sort of finding the things that you're solid on and have a good understanding of, and perhaps have built good functionality to serve, or you have a good process that backs that up, and find things that perhaps you haven't paid as much attention to as you need to. Things that you may have missed, or things that you may not understand, or things that you really need to look into and learn more about.
Thank you for joining us for Seeing the Gaps, Journey Mapping for Better Health Outcomes.